The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Hotham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on this bill, and I want to thank the member for Banks for his contribution. He made some good points. Some of them I'm in furious agreement with him about, but others I'm not, Deputy Speaker. And before I turn to the specifics of this bill, I'll just note we heard a bit of assertions about economic maxims, and one of the first economic maxims you learn in trade economics is that trade agreements create winners and losers. And what I find disappointing about some of the tenor of the discussion that's been had about the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement is the idea that we can't have a really frank national discussion that looks at, beneath the surface of what is in the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and a really frank conversation about who is winning and who is losing under this agreement. There are significant, legitimate concerns about the impact on the labour market in Australia, and I say that as someone with a lot of economics training and someone who considers herself to be very strongly supportive of free trade. But as anyone who is well versed in discussions about free trade knows, these agreements are not just about free trade, and we need to be very careful that we make good trade-offs that are in the interests of everyday Australians when we make these agreements. Otherwise, we lose the argument with the Australian people, Deputy Speaker. If we don't make good free trade agreements, then free trade itself gets called into question, and that's not something I think that either side of the House wants to see. Deputy Speaker, we've heard from members on both sides of the House about what a great opportunity the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is for Australia, and I'll add some remarks on that basis. Many other speakers have talked about the very large infrastructure gap that we see across Asia. Some have estimated this lack of expenditure to be somewhere around $8 trillion over the next decade. And Deputy Speaker, when Asia doesn't have the infrastructure it needs for development, it's something that costs everyone in the world. It certainly costs people living in Asia as they struggle to develop in the way that we want to see. But it also costs Australians, because the frank reality is for Asian nations to export to Australia, they need to travel on roads and use rail and use ports and all these other facilities, and that adds cost to us as Australians and particularly to Australian consumers. One of the really fantastic stories of the last 30 or 40 years, looking at the globe as a whole, is the fantastic increase to the standard of living we've seen across many countries in Asia, Deputy Speaker. And it's through investment in infrastructure that we actually see people's standard of living grow. So as an internationalist, as someone who's supportive of development right across the world, I'm very excited about what's occurring and Australia's involvement in it. We know that the bank will help catalyse private sector investment, so this is not just about foreign governments and foreign countries looking to invest in infrastructure, but bringing in all of the parties to co-finance projects. And the member for Banks talked at great length about the importance of multilateralism, and again, that's something we want to see more and more of in our region. It's a great opportunity, Deputy Speaker, for Australia to deepen the links and deepen the relationship that we have with our Asian neighbours, and it's been good to see us getting in on the ground floor, though I think we could probably have done it a little bit more seamlessly, which I'll talk about it in a moment. But it's also, I think, a symbol of our shared commitment as Australians to development in Asia, and this is something that we really want to get across to people living right across this region. As Australians, we want to do everything we can to build living standards in Asia, to help people in Asia bring up to the standard of living that we enjoy as Australians, and being part of this bank and being an enthusiastic member is definitely a part of that. So we welcome the commitment to the principle of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We welcome the financial commitment that's being put forward. One thing I think other speakers on this side have talked about is a little bit of frustration that this decision wasn't come to earlier and more enthusiastically on part of the government. It has been, frankly, quite confusing to watch the debate that's occurred on the other side of the House about how to manage the proposal for Australia to be a foundation member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Because, Deputy Speaker, you've heard flourishing speeches from both sides of the House about all of the great benefits. Why then did it take months for the government to decide that it actually wanted to be involved? And it was actually Labor that came out very early, straight out of the blocks, to point out what huge benefits there were in participating in such an institution, and why we get more and more benefits the earlier and the more enthusiastically we engage with these institutions. Deputy Speaker, I raise this point not just to be political, but because I think it reflects something that underlies a lot of our discussion and our engagement with Asian economies as Australians, that I think is a real barrier to us getting the most out of growth in that region. So I want to talk about these attitudes and a little bit about what we can do about them as Australian governments. Deputy Speaker, I think what the kind of ambivalence of attitude that we saw when this proposal was initially put to the Australian government just reflects within the psyche of some Australians a lack of comfort that we feel about really participating fully and being engaged within our own region. I think it also demonstrates something equally terrifying, which is this kind of sense of fait accompli, that just because we're somewhere in the Asian region, that we're just innately going to benefit and we're going to grow as Asia grows around us. And I think on both counts, Deputy Speaker, they're quite false assumptions. And when we look to the things that are going to drive prosperity in Australia in the long term, being a part of Asia, committing to being a part of Asia, feeling ourselves to be a part of Asia is absolutely central to making sure that we continue another generation of prosperity in this country. I think one of the really terrifying implications of these attitudes is the sense that, policy doesn't matter when we think about making the most of the Asian opportunity. And that seemed to be the sense that we got from those on the other side of politics, that here was this suggestion, we'll maybe consider it, there seem to be downsides, there seem to be upsides. I just think that's completely the wrong approach to take. Policy is going to be essential. If we don't get the policy settings right, then we're going to be living in the midst of this incredibly fast-growing and eventually incredibly prosperous region, but we're not going to get the benefits because we've decided that we're going to step back. We're not going to think that we need to do anything to capture this opportunity and just believe that it will be delivered to us on a platter, and it just won't. Now, there's going to be no argument from anyone in this House, I know, that Australia's future lies very much within Asia. And all of the data and the evidence that we can look to makes that very clear. Obviously, China is already Australia's largest export partner. And when you look at the top 10 export partners, I think 6 of those are Asian countries today, Deputy Speaker. So we include Singapore, Malaysia, Korea on the list there. Now, it's very exciting for Australia that we've already got these great, thriving trading relationships, because we all know that there's an incredible growth story unfolding right before our very eyes. By 2040, some economists think that 2 out of every $3 of wealth created will come from within our region. Half of every dollar of wealth created will come from China and India alone, Deputy Speaker. This is an absolutely staggering change in the whole of the centre of economic power in the world, and it's something from which Australia can, of course, benefit so significantly. One of the things that you find, though, quite disturbingly, Deputy Speaker, when you look at the actual evidence of how we're embracing this opportunity and engaging with it across different sectors of our economy, you do see some real causes for concern. PwC produced a very interesting report last year called Passing Us By, and they did a very large survey of Australian businesses and came up with some really terrifying statistics. One of those, Deputy Speaker, was that today only 9% of Australian businesses are doing business in a significant way in Asia. 9%. Now, for all the talk we have in this parliament and around the various forums that we participate in, it's a shocking statistic to think that less than 1 in 10 of Australia's businesses are engaging with Asia. Not only that, Deputy Speaker, but the report showed that this doesn't reflect a general reticence on behalf of Australian businesses to engage overseas. The report found, in fact, that Australian companies are investing 7 times as much in New Zealand than they are in China. Now, that's just a wild fact when you think about the incredible growth, not just the current size of China compared to New Zealand, but what we'll see over the coming years. We saw PwC also found in that report that not only are we engaging more with New Zealand than we are with some much bigger partners, But when we look to the rest of the world, there's actually very enthusiastic investment and engagement happening on behalf of the Americas, on behalf of European nations in Asia. So we're really getting left behind in all this, while we see other countries around the world really trying to pick up this opportunity. Now, with my colleague here, the member for Gellibrand, we've just done a pretty big piece of work about some of these issues, and in doing that we talked to a lot of exporters about why it is that some of them are struggling so much to push into this region. And they talked to us about some very practical problems. I mean, probably the first thing that people raise with you, Deputy Speaker, is the language barrier. So you'd think we'd have a thriving and exciting push within Australian schools to be learning Asian languages, but what we find there, again, Deputy Speaker, is a very disappointing outcome, and that is that today only 6% of Australian students are learning an Asian language at school, and that we're actually going backwards on this, Deputy Speaker. So there were more students as a share of the school population learning Asian languages in the year 2000 than there are today in 2015. Again, Speaker, the point here, policy really matters. We need to address this. We need to do something about it. Something else that we heard a lot from exporters is that having trusting relationships with people in Asia takes a lot of time to cement. Learning about the different economics in different Asian markets takes time to do, and what PwC found was that it was taking somewhere around 15 years for an Australian company going into Asia to start to really make serious money. So 15 years is a really long commitment, and when we see, I think on average, CEO tenures in Australia are something like 4.2 years, you can understand why we're not seeing that real kind of push into Asia. Probably doesn't help that when big Australian companies, listed companies, have tried to go into Asia, they're often pummeled by business analysts who say, that this is a wild and crazy and outlandish thing to do. Again, Deputy Speaker, just reflecting this basic attitude. People are talking the talk about the big opportunity that lays ahead, but when we look at the actual activities of Australian businesses, we're just not seeing what we want to see. There's issues around government too, Deputy Speaker. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade probably needs to do some thinking and some work about its Asian expertise and Asian language capabilities within the department. So, unfortunately, Deputy Speaker, I'm speaking very positively about the opportunity that we see today with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I just want to make sure that when we have these debates in the Parliament, we have them in a measured and fact-based way. And as much as it might feel good for us to all come into this chamber and speak very excitedly about all of the opportunities that lay ahead, I want us to be really cognizant of the facts. And the facts are that when we look at the education system and when we look at different aspects of the machinery of government, and especially when we look at business, we're not seeing the kind of enthusiasm, the kind of engagement, the kind of upskilling in the Asian competencies that we're going to need to see to make the most out of this incredible growth. So, Deputy Speaker, what do we need to do about all of these things? I think the first thing is that we need to have a national discussion about how it is that we're going to make the most of this opportunity. And it's not going to be through machinery of governments or bills that we put through this Parliament. It's about everyday Australians understanding the realities of living in the Asian region and thinking about how they, as individuals, are going to do better to engage with our neighbours. Deputy Speaker, it's fascinating to talk to businesses because you'd think they'd raise, very practical barriers, legal barriers to taking advantage of these export opportunities. But when it really comes down to it, the main barriers are about people, people-to-people links, having trusted relationships across national boundaries. And this is the sort of thing that government's actually inherently capable of assisting with. So some of the things are around, really pushing education transfers, so we make sure that the brightest and best young people in China and other Asian countries are coming here to Australia, not just to study but to learn about our culture, to make friends and just develop trusting relationships with Australians, and we'd like to see a lot more of that going back in the other direction too. I'll just finish by coming back to where I began, which is talking about the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, Deputy Speaker. And I just say again, I think we just need to be a lot more nuanced in the discussion we're having today in this Parliament about all of these issues. It's not just the bank over which there was, this sort of seemingly pretty silly political tussle, but it's about things like the Free Trade Agreement, and it's about the set of government policies that are going to need to support Australia getting the most out of this region. The opportunity's there, but we need to embrace it enthusiastically and get the policy right, and that's the discussion I think we need to be having. Thank you.
Thank you.